policy leaders, but we're designing it for like my dad who needs to know whether or not he should mask up before he goes to the grocery store, or if he should just stay home and order groceries. Or like we had such an inundation of like lay users saying like, I'm looking at your data to determine like whether or not I like send my kids to school, whether I, you know, and thank you. And like we get tons of just like feedback around this, you know, in smaller populations, like I noticed this uptick and we would like to know what's driving it, and, you know, like how can we help? And so the design of the entire site is for the lay user, is for the public user. Where we've seen it really effectively leveraged is in policymaking. So we know that a lot of governors and mayors are using our data. They're, you know, we have like states that are like essentially just like, you know, building applications on top of it. And that's what they're using in terms of their transparency around coronavirus. We see, you know, we created the initial kind of like dashboard view of all the data. And now we know that it's like in hundreds of different governments have replicated it. So they've either just taken our data. Everything we did at the design of this is public data. Everything is public. How, like the map is public. All of the ways that we're sharing the data is public. So if you want to replicate it, you can do that. And so we know we have a lot of governments that are replicating the work and using it as a way to also get information to local resources who wouldn't necessarily just come to the Hopkins site to get the information. Which is why we have 10 billion calls on the data and we have 900 million people that are just looking at the JHU site on her. And so, you know, it's like a staggering, you know, it's a staggering scale. It started with a very small and scrappy team. We've had the benefit of being able, because of philanthropic investment, to grow our teams a little bit and to relieve some of the, you know, there, like many of us, including Lainey and I, were up all night on launch nights when we were putting out the initial set. And so of these visualizations, but we were doing that because we wanted to make sure that our lay users would be able to actually understand what we were trying to communicate and then internalize it into their own response to the pandemic.
Right. That's so interesting to me, especially as you kind of pulled along the lines that there weren't as sort of straightforward directives coming from policymakers and how people sort of use the data to then inform their own decisions. You can tell by the site that it's super user-friendly. I've been on it myself even before this project, it's like looking around, and I'm very impressed at kind of all the different, you know, trends that you guys are able to lay out. I wonder, sort of in launching the project, I know it sort of evolved, so you might not have a specific sort of like earmark of, you know, what it looks like, or sort of like a specific, you know, as of March 12th, you know, this is how it looks like now. I know it's kind of been changing as it goes, but have there been any specific challenges sort of in getting the site up and running, or, you know, I guess for you and in your endeavor to democratize this data, you know, what have been the challenges, if any, that you've kind of encountered in trying to provide this sort of public resource?
Well, the data has been the main thing, which is like, there's been no guidance on how to like share information. So like in any other time, the CDC would have said, okay, like this is the kind of data that you need to collect. This is how it's going to be collected. Then we're going to share it out. And here's the guidance and here's a data standard. And like, we would activate like a whole system around the data pieces. That didn't happen. So we were just kind of doing it ourselves and essentially creating our own governance. And then, you know, for a time it was just us. And then the COVID tracking project kind of emerged. And so we started calling the COVID tracking project and say like, hey, you guys are looking at testing data. It's the kind of next frontier. Let's agree amongst ourselves, like what should these standards look like and how should we be thinking about it? And we started creating all these like sort of ad hoc mechanisms for getting data out there. And then we started to identify these opportunities where we could like all of a sudden, you know, we had governors who were calling us and saying like, wait a second, your data doesn't look right. And we're like, oh, we're now that source. So now we have this kind of opportunity to influence the way that the data then gets published. And so we started to use that opportunity. So early on, we knew that we needed to look at racial disparity data. And if we weren't getting data around the disease that was broken down by race and by ethnicity, then we would never be able to tell the real story about how this ineffective health system that we work within is actually, manifesting in the COVID context. And so we have this racial disparity map, which I affectionately call sort of the name and shame map, which started off as very vacant kind of gray states that said like, no one is expressing this data broken down in this way, except for this very small handful. And we had used a press push and said, we want the data broken down by race. And slowly we saw the map start to populate, which was telling me that we were influencing these decisions around how states were expressing and releasing and collecting the data. And then we learned like a lot of the labs who were doing the initial testing didn't even have like racial questions on their collection forms. And we're like, why would you do that? So then we started to use the same kind of influence to try to push in and make sure that they were collecting the right data. And so the data has been the biggest challenge. Like we still are having daily arguments around positivity calculations because every state is calculating it differently and collecting testing data differently. And so we created a standard and we've been using it since March around how we calculate positivity. But as states have evolved their testing practices and really understood their testing data, they're saying like, we are getting a lower number because we're doing a better version of it. We're like, great, keep reporting it, keep talking about it. But not every state is doing what you're doing. And until we get uniformity of the way that we're collecting this information, we know that we can only calculate it in this way. And so the lack of standards and the lack of a consistent way to think about the release of data has been a real problem. And there's no normal reality where Johns Hopkins University should be the standard bearer, but we have evolved into this position. And if you look at all of the other tracking sites like New York Times and like COVID Act Now and that have now grown out of this movement, a lot of it is rooted in these kind of arbitrary standards that we made very early on around how we would count things and how we would frame things. And that, has been for us, one of the, I think a source of pride, certainly for the site, but also a source of frustration that we're now in this kind of weird role.
Right. Sort of in real time, you had to make those sort of calls because they weren't provided from the onset in terms of the data standards and stuff. I wonder, have you had to sort of reassess how some of these sort of calculations have been made? Has there ever been a moment where you all sort of decided to change your methodology a little bit because of sort of what you were hearing from other stakeholders? I'm just curious about that. But
we haven't yet. I mean, the testing positivity one is probably the place where people really want us to change the way that we do it. And we're not doing that yet. And a lot of that, we are researching it all the time. So we have a whole data operation that does all kinds of data validation, and we're running scenario planning and we're looking at it. So we've seen the view of what it looks like using different calculations. And we know right now, this is the only sort of stable one that we can get for all states. I'm not inclined to make big changes because people I think we're in this very precarious moment as a country where people their trust in science is being shaken by the politicization of a global pandemic, which is mind-boggling on many fronts. But there is something in there where we are a reliable source. We have the documentation to show exactly our methods. There's nothing not transparent about the way that we've gone about it. We've been consistent. And I think that is actually a comfort to many people who feel very conflicted about what to think about what they're hearing from other sources.
Right. You've been able to build that sort of rapport with the public and sort of confidence through your platform. So I think I kind of want to switch a little bit to kind of understanding how your platform is currently operating and currently